He was taking some pictures with some children, my people, during the celebration of All Souls Day. And then some people arrived and practically shot him.
When a Mexican mayor was assassinated in broad daylight, all eyes turned to President Claudia Sheinbaum. Her reaction, measured, almost detached, has divided the country. Supporters call it composure. Critics call it cold indifference. Today, we break down what really happened. The fall of a fearless mayor, November 1st, 2025, the Day of the Dead, one of Mexico's most sacred cultural celebrations. Families gather in plazas across the country, lighting candles, sharing stories, and honoring those who have passed. In the historic Central Plaza of Uruapan, a city nestled in the heart of Michoacán state, hundreds of people assembled for a candlelight vigil and festival. The atmosphere was festive, peaceful, almost sacred. Among the crowd stood Carlos Manzo Rodriguez, the 40-year-old mayor of this city, a man who had become something of a folk hero for standing up to the brutal drug cartels that have terrorized his region for years. At approximately 9 p.m., Mayor Manzo had just finished inaugurating the evening's events. He was holding a microphone in one hand, his young son cradled in the other arm, when suddenly, cutting through the celebratory noise, there was a sound that no one at a Day of the Dead festival should ever have to hear. Gunshots. 5 to 7 shots rang out in rapid succession, fired from a 9mm pistol at close range. An unidentified gunman approached through the crowd and opened fire on the mayor in what can only be described as a brazen, calculated execution. Chaos erupted instantly with attendees scattered in every direction. Eyewitness videos that would later circulate on social media platforms like X captured the horrifying scene in graphic detail. The moment of the shooting, the muzzle flashes piercing the darkness, families fleeing for their lives, and emergency responders desperately rushing to aid the fallen mayor. Paramedics performed CPR right there in the plaza, and even though Carlos Manzo was rushed to a local hospital, he later succumbed to his wounds. His death was a total shock to the entire nation. Now here's where this story becomes even more tragic and infuriating. This wasn't just a random act of violence. This wasn't some unfortunate case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. No, Carlos Manzo saw this coming. He predicted his own death. In Oboe, September 2025 interview, just weeks before his assassination, Manzo had stated with haunting prescience that he didn't want to be just another mayor on the list of those executed. He knew the cartels were after him. He knew the danger he faced every single day. And he had been pleading, literally begging, the federal government for protection, for resources, for someone, anyone, to take the cartel threat in Uruapan seriously. Let me paint you a fuller picture of who Carlos Manzo was, because understanding this man is crucial to understanding why his death has ignited such fury across Mexico. Manzo was a former legislator from the Morena Party who ran as an independent in the 2024 elections, breaking away from the political establishment because he believed they were too compromised, too corrupt, too willing to make deals with the devil, or in this case, with the cartels. He earned a reputation as a fierce anti-crime advocate, someone who didn't just talk tough, but actually walked the streets of his city, often wearing a bulletproof vest, directly confronting the cartel extortion that had turned Uruapan's avocado industry into a battleground. And let's talk about those avocados for a moment, because they're not just a trendy toast topping. They're at the heart of this entire bloody conflict. Michoacán state produces 80% of Mexico's avocados, fueling billions of dollars in exports to the United States and other countries. But where there's money, there are cartels. Groups like the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, known as CJNG, and their rivals like La Familia Michoacana have turned the avocado trade into their personal cash cow, extorting farmers, controlling supply chains, kidnapping workers, and executing anyone who dares to resist their so-called avocado plazas, territories they control through sheer terror and violence. Manzo refused to bow to this terror. He raided cartel hideouts. He arrested local cartel figures. In August 2025, he personally oversaw the arrest of a leader from the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, a move that likely sealed his fate. He exposed ties between local police and narcos, cleaning house even when it meant making enemies of people who were supposed to be on his side. The people of Uruapan loved him for it. They called him the Mexican Bucal, comparing him to El Salvador's President Nayib Bukele, who has taken an iron-fisted approach to gang violence in his own country. But here's what makes this assassination even more disturbing. Carlos Manzo had federal protection. He wasn't some isolated mayor left to fend for himself. Since December 2024, he had been assigned federal bodyguards. In May 2025, that protection was bolstered with 14 National Guard members for perimeter security and local police for close detail. He had direct communication lines with territorial commands from both the National Guard and the Secretariat of National Defense. On paper, Carlos Manzo should have been one of the most protected mayors in all of Mexico. Yet despite all of this protection, despite all the security measures, despite all the promises from the federal government, the assailants exploited the crowded public setting of the Day of the Dead celebration to bypass these safeguards. They walked right up to him, surrounded by hundreds of witnesses, protected by federal guards, and executed him in cold blood while he held his child. Think about the audacity of that. Think about the message that sends, not just to other mayors, not just to other politicians, but to every single Mexican citizen who might dare to stand up to the cartels. In the immediate aftermath of the shooting, one attacker was killed in a subsequent shootout with security forces, and 2 others were arrested. Initial investigations pointed directly to cartel involvement, with the 9mm pistol used in the assassination later linked to prior cartel clashes in the area. But while some attackers were captured, the damage was done. A mayor was dead, a family was shattered, and an entire nation was left asking, if they can kill Carlos Manzo with all his protection, with all his visibility, with all his pleas for help, then who is safe? Who can stand against the cartels when standing against them means a death sentence, federal protection or not? This is where the fear and uncertainty truly begin, because Carlos Manzo's assassination didn't just take one life. It ignited a firestorm that would engulf Mexico's political establishment and force President Claudia Sheinbaum into the most serious crisis of her young presidency. Because think about it, under President Sheinbaum's Morena government, homicide rates hover at 25-30 per 100,000 people, with over 30,000 cartel-linked murders annually. To put that in perspective, that's nearly 100 people killed every single day in cartel-related violence. It's a war zone, and the government's response and strategies, however well-intentioned, are not stopping the killing. One very disturbing aspect of all this is that President Sheinbaum's problems are about to get much, much worse. Because while she was issuing statements and convening cabinet meetings and dispatching troops, the Mexican people are taking to the streets. A president's controversial response. In the hours following Carlos Manzo's assassination, all eyes turned to Mexico City, to the National Palace, to President Claudia Sheinbaum, the woman who had taken office just 1 month earlier in October 2024. How would she respond? What would she say to a grieving city, to a terrified nation, to millions of Mexicans who were demanding answers, demanding action, demanding justice? The response, when it finally came, was measured, careful, and to many, woefully inadequate. Approximately 19 hours after the shooting, at around 4:17 p.m. GMT on November 2nd, President Sheinbaum posted her first public statement on X.
Lo segundo, pues, es este condenable, cobarde, vil homicidio a Carlos Manzo, alcalde de Europa. Primero, condenar el homicidio. Segundo, nuestra solidaridad y condolencias a la familia, a sus seres queridos.
Sheinbaum condemned with absolute firmness the vile assassination of Uruapan's municipal president, Carlos Manzo. She expressed her deepest condolences to his family, loved ones, and the people of Uruapan over the irreparable loss. According to her, upon learning of the tragedy, she immediately spoke with the governor of Michoacán and the Secretary of Security and Citizen Protection, Omar Garcia Harfuch, who has remained in constant contact with the state prosecutor. Sheinbaum also convened the security cabinet to ensure full support for Michoacán and to guarantee that there will be no impunity. Her statement continued, emphasizing that Manzo had federal protection and that the territorial commands of defense and the National Guard had maintained communication with him. She promised that the security cabinet would hold a press conference to report transparently on the investigation's progress, and she concluded with what would become her administration's mantra in the days ahead. We reaffirm our commitment to deploy all the state's efforts to achieve peace and security with zero impunity and justice. This post garnered over 13,000 likes and an astonishing 4 million views within hours, becoming one of the most watched political statements in recent Mexican history. But while the numbers were impressive, the reaction from the Mexican people was far from positive. Critics immediately seized on what they saw as a significant delay. 19 hours is an eternity in the age of social media, especially when a beloved public figure has been murdered in front of hundreds of witnesses. Where was the president? Why did it take so long for her to speak? And more fundamentally, were her words enough? Behind the scenes, according to official reports, President Sheinbaum had actually been working from the moment she learned of the attack around midnight on November 1st. By Sunday morning, November 2nd, she had convened an emergency session of her security cabinet in Mexico City to coordinate federal support for Michoacán. Additional federal forces, including National Guard and Army units, were also dispatched to Uruapan and the surrounding areas. In a video statement that would later surface, showing Security Secretary Omar Garcia Harfuch addressing the media, we get a glimpse of the government's official narrative.
Mantenemos comunicación permanente con el gobierno del estado de Michoacán y hemos intensificado los esfuerzos coordinados para fortalecer la seguridad en Uruapan y en toda la región. Lamentablemente, los agresores aprovecharon la vulnerabilidad de un evento público para realizar el ataque. Condenamos enérgicamente este crimen y tengan la certeza de que no habrá impunidad. Como en otros casos, llegaremos hasta las últimas consecuencias para que este acto cobarde sea plenamente esclarecido y todos los responsables sean detenidos.
The message was clear. The government was taking this seriously. They were deploying resources. They were investigating. They would bring the perpetrators to justice. But for many Mexicans, especially those in Uruapan and across Michoacán, these words rang hollow. Because here's the uncomfortable truth that President Sheinbaum had to confront. Carlos Manzo himself had been one of her most vocal critics. In September 2025, just weeks before his death, Manzo had given interviews where he accused state officials of corruption and pacts with organized crime. He had repeatedly appealed directly to President Sheinbaum and Security Minister Garcia Harfuch for more resources, including military deployments, but felt he had received only limited support beyond his existing security detail. Manzo had criticized the administration's signature security policy, the hugs, not bullets approach inherited from former President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, which prioritizes social programs and addressing root causes of crime over direct military confrontation with the cartels. This policy, known in Spanish as abrazos, no balazos, has been the cornerstone of Morena party governance. The theory is sound. You can't shoot your way out of the cartel problem. You need to address poverty, provide opportunities, and offer alternatives to young people who might otherwise be recruited by narcos. But Carlos Manzo, standing in the blood-soaked streets of Uruapan, watching his city's avocado farmers extorted and his citizens terrorized, didn't have the luxury of waiting for long-term social programs to bear fruit. He needed help now. He needed troops. He needed the government to take the fight to the cartels with the same ferocity that the cartels brought to his city every single day. And this is where President Sheinbaum finds herself caught between a rock and a hard place. She inherited a security strategy from her predecessor and political mentor, López Obrador. She built her campaign around continuing his legacy. But now, with Carlos Manzo lying dead, and his blood literally on the hands of cartel members who operated with seeming impunity, she faces a fundamental question. Can the hugs, not bullets, approach survive this moment? Or does Manzo's assassination represent the policy's complete and utter failure? The international community was watching closely. The United States responded swiftly, with Deputy Secretary of State Christopher Landau denouncing the assassination and offering deepened bilateral cooperation on security, including intelligence sharing and joint operations under the Merida Initiative. This comes at a particularly sensitive time in U.S.-Mexico relations, with American concerns about fentanyl flows and disruptions to the avocado trade. Yes, Americans love their avocados, and cartel violence in Michoacán directly affects guacamole prices in the United States. But there's another layer to the international dimension that makes this story even more complex. In a separate video that is circulated online, we see President Sheinbaum discussing a conversation she had with US President Trump about security cooperation.
El presidente Trump dijo, queremos ayudar a México. Y para ayudar a México, pues queremos mandarles, entre otras, tropas, o si es que lo necesitan. Y yo le dije, no, presidente Trump, eso no. Podemos colaborar en muchas otras cosas dentro del marco de nuestra soberanía y de la territorialidad que a cada uno de nosotros nos corresponde.
Think about that for a moment. The United States has offered to send troops to help Mexico fight the cartels, an unprecedented offer from an American president, and Mexico has declined. President Sheinbaum invoked sovereignty and territorial integrity, arguing that Mexico can handle its own problems, that cooperation can take other forms. But now, with a mayor dead despite federal protection, with cartels operating with seeming impunity, with Michoacán descending into chaos, many Mexicans are asking, was that the right decision? Should Mexico have accepted help when it was offered? How many more Carlos Manzos have to die before the government admits it needs a different approach? The sheer scale of the violence cannot be overstated. This is part of a deadly pattern. At least 30 local officials have been murdered in Mexico in 2025 alone. Before the 2024 elections, as many as 37 candidates were killed, according to Intellect Consultancy. Carlos Manzo is just the latest in a line that includes figures like Tacámbaro Mayor Salvador Bastidas, who was shot dead with his bodyguard in June 2025 upon returning home. Like Manzo, he had also criticized state corruption and cartel influence, actions that experts now suggest may have fueled this recent assassination. The deeper crisis and what it means for Mexico. If President Sheinbaum thought her statement and security cabinet meeting would calm the situation, she was about to receive a brutal awakening. Because the Mexican people, particularly the young people, Generation Z activists who have grown up surrounded by cartel violence their entire lives, were done with statements. They were done with promises. They were done with zero impunity slogans that never seemed to translate into actual justice. They wanted action, they wanted change, and they were willing to fight for it. On November 2nd, the day after the assassination, thousands of people marched silently through the streets of Uruapan, dressed in black, carrying photographs of Carlos Manzo, accompanied by mariachi bands playing mournful music. The chants echoed through the city, "Justice! Out with Morena! The government killed him!" That last chant is particularly significant. They're not saying the cartels killed him, they're saying the government killed him. The protesters were placing blame squarely on the political establishment, on the Morena party that has governed Mexico for years, on the policies that they believe have enabled cartel violence to flourish unchecked. The procession, guarded by police and military forces, ended at Manzo's home without incident. It was peaceful, dignified, a community mourning one of its own, but it was also a powder keg waiting for a spark. And that spark would come the very next day in Morelia, the capital of Michoacán state, located about 120 kilometers from Uruapan. On November 3rd, hundreds of protesters, many of them young Generation Z activists, stormed the state government palace in Morelia, and this was no peaceful march. Videos that went viral across social media platforms showed demonstrators smashing doors, hurling Molotov cocktails, and clashing violently with riot police. Police responded with tear gas and made numerous arrests, with some reports alleging that detainees were tortured. The videos are absolutely stunning. One viral clip captured by social media users shows crowds yelling, "Government murdered him," as they breached security barriers, with fires set inside the government building itself. The protesters' demands were clear. They wanted Governor Alfredo Ramirez Bedola's resignation. They accused the Morena-led federal government of enabling narco rule, and they called for a complete overhaul of Mexico's approach to cartel violence. The hashtags Justicia para Manzo and Jobasa Fuera Morena trended globally on social media, with millions of tweets, posts, and shares spreading the images of what many were calling a revolution. And this wasn't just happening in Michoacán. Protests also spread to other cities across Mexico, including Mexico City itself, the seat of federal power. just blocks from where President Sheinbaum works. The public sentiment on social media was overwhelmingly critical of the government. Posts from influential users garnered thousands of likes, with some framing the situation as cartels winning due to federal neglect. Other users also highlighted what they called a revolution led by youth, with one user sharing videos of the palace occupation. The narrative taking hold on social media was damning. The Mexican government has lost control. The cartels run the country, and young people are rising up to demand change because their parents' generation has failed them. But here's where the story gets even more complicated, and where we need to understand the fuller context of what's happening in Mexico. Because while the protesters' anger is absolutely justified, the solutions being demanded are not simple, and they come with their own serious risks. Some protesters are calling for US-style interventions, essentially asking for American military support to fight the cartels. Others are demanding Bukele-inspired crackdowns, referring to El Salvador's president, who has arrested tens of thousands of suspected gang members, often without due process, in what he calls a war on gangs. These approaches might sound appealing when you're burying your mayor, when you're watching your city torn apart by violence, when you've lost all faith in your government's ability to protect you. But they also raise profound questions about civil liberties, sovereignty, and whether fighting terror with terror is really a path to lasting peace. Consider what we learned from another video featuring Rodney Scott, discussing the challenges of combating cartel violence.
The cartels are like off the charts violent. And in this country, you know, we joke or talk about corruption, but down there, basically the cartel tries to bribe the government officials, but if they don't take the millions of dollars or whatever it is, then they threaten to kill their family and their kids. So that's what we're trying to overcome.
This is the reality that President Sheinbaum faces. The cartels, particularly groups like the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, operate through a brutal combination of bribery and terror. They offer government officials a simple choice: accept our money and look the other way, or we'll murder your entire family. It's not just corruption in the traditional sense, it's extortion at gunpoint, terrorism masquerading as business, and the money involved is staggering. Michoacan alone sees annual extortion payments exceeding $100 million to groups like CJNG, who use violence to control supply chains in the avocado industry. The state is home to over 200,000 hectares of avocado orchards, producing the vast majority of avocados consumed in the United States. Every avocado toast, every bowl of guacamole, every avocado sold at American supermarkets is potentially funding this cycle of violence, extortion, and murder. Governor Ramirez Bedolla, facing calls for his resignation, called the killing cowardly and mobilized state police for Manzo's funeral. But he faced sharp criticism, and not without reason. Carlos Manzo himself had accused the governor of shielding corrupt officers, of being complicit in the cartel police nexus that makes meaningful law enforcement nearly impossible. When a mayor accuses his own governor of corruption and is then murdered despite federal protection, you can understand why people might draw certain conclusions about who wanted him silenced. So, where does this leave President Sheinbaum? Well, let's just say she's trapped in what might be the most difficult position any Mexican president has faced in decades. On one side, she has her party's ideological commitment to the hugs, not bullets strategy, a policy that has genuine merit in theory. You can't arrest or kill your way out of a problem that has deep roots in poverty, inequality, and lack of opportunity. On the other side, she has a growing body count, increasingly bold cartels, and a population, especially young people, who are literally storming government buildings demanding action. The pressure is coming from all directions. Domestically, protesters fill the streets. Internationally, the United States is offering help while simultaneously pressuring Mexico to do more about fentanyl trafficking and violence that threatens American interests. And all the while, mayors like Carlos Manzo, brave people who are just trying to protect their communities, continue to die. As of now, the situation remains fluid and extremely tense. President Sheinbaum's next action is eagerly anticipated. Will she announce a policy shift? Will she deploy more troops to Michoacan? Will she acknowledge that the current approach isn't working and that something needs to change? Or will she double down on the hugs, not bullets strategy, arguing that it needs more time, more resources, More commitment? The assassination of Carlos Manzo Rodriguez represents more than just another tragedy in Mexico's long, bloody struggle with cartel violence. It represents a turning point, a moment when the gap between government promises and street-level reality became so wide that it could no longer be bridged with statements and cabinet meetings. It represents the frustration of a generation that has grown up knowing that standing up for what's right might get you killed, and that the government that's supposed to protect you might not or can't keep you safe. The protesters chanting in Morelia have made their position clear. No more words, no more promises, no more zero impunity slogans that never translate into actual justice. Right now, they want action, they want results. They want a Mexico where mayors don't get executed at public festivals, where federal protection actually means protection, where standing up to cartels doesn't automatically mean signing your own death warrant. Whether President Claudia Sheinbaum can deliver on these demands, or whether anyone can deliver on these demands, remains to be seen. But one thing is absolutely certain: the assassination of Carlos Manzo Rodriguez has changed Mexico. The question now is, in what direction will that change lead? Toward reform and renewed commitment to peace, or toward militarization and confrontation? The answer to that question will determine not just President Sheinbaum's political future, but the future of Mexico itself. The whole world is watching, and Carlos Manzo, the mayor who refused to be silent, who refused to bow to terror, who died trying to protect his city, his legacy will be measured by what happens next. Will his death be just another statistic in Mexico's endless catalog of cartel violence? Or will it be the moment when everything finally changed? Only time will tell. But for now, Mexico stands at a precipice, and President Sheinbaum stands with it, facing the most consequential decisions of her presidency. Do you think this assassination was a political message, or the beginning of something much darker in Mexico's power struggle? Let me know your thoughts in the comments section. And for more videos like this, click on this next card on your screen.